Imagine having an useless ability in a world where the abilities you receive at birth determine your value to society. Terrible, right? But that's exactly what happened to Fate, the protagonist of this story. But don't worry, despite his ability seeming like trash and only making Fate feel hungry, it has a hidden effect that will completely change Fate's life. Come with me to check out this sensational story. Without further ado, let's get to the recap. The anime begins by showing an old man in a cart traveling peacefully. However, this won't last long, since instants later, a large group of goblins begin to chase him, and one of them even manages to climb onto the old man's cart. Desperate, he begins to call for help, hoping that someone could help him. Well, fortunately a group of adventurers were passing by, and immediately they rescue him. They begin defeating the goblins with some ease. Now observe something here with me. Look at the size of this guy, compare his size to the guy next to him riding on horseback. This guy is huge, my friend. He certainly made love with the juice. After that, we go to the city. And here we have the first appearance of Fate, our protagonist. And right off the bat, his stomach rumbles because of his ability called gluttony. At some point, those adventurers from earlier pass in front of Fate talking about their goblin hunt. Fate observes and tells himself that he would never do that. Well, we'll see that he couldn't be more wrong in a while. But for now, Fate continues with his stomach rumbling and dying of hunger while doing his guard job. Thinking, he says he's just a useless guy with a stomach that never stops rumbling, thanks to his ability gluttony that he received at birth. After that, we go to the center of the city where the holy knights are passing by. Despite being nobles, many people do not see them in a good light. Next, 3 holy knights arrive. Raphael, the leader, asks if Fate did a good job in their place while they were away, and the boy promptly confirms. And since he did, Raphael throws Fate's payment on the ground and tells him to pick it up. Here we clearly know who the villains of this story are. Fate does as he is told and bends down to pick up the few coins he received as payment. But when he was picking them up, Raphael waves to Hado and soon the knight steps on Fate's hands. He says that Fate was so dirty that he barely noticed the difference between him and the ground. What a stupid guy. At this moment, Fate's stomach rumbles again. This makes Raphael very angry, as it seems they are not feeding him. And soon Fate begins to be beaten up. While being beaten up, Fate thinks. He says that in that world there are those who have things, and those who do not. And what differentiates them are the special powers given by the gods, called abilities. And meanwhile, Fate continues to be beaten mercilessly, until finally Roxy, another holy knight arrives, and orders them to stop immediately, thus saving Fate. She confronts them saying that this attitude does not match that of the holy knights, who in theory should be the ones protecting the citizen. And she also says that it is their duty to protect the gates, not other people like Fate. Raphael sarcastically says that it is also the duty of the holy knights to provide employment for those who do not have it, and he is only doing Fate a favor. She looks at Fate, still under Hado's boots, and asks if this kind of treatment is really necessary. The scoundrel knight says that this only shows that he and Roxy have different views. And soon he goes away with his henchmen. After that, Roxy immediately runs to help Fate and cleans his wounds. My friends, you can't keep getting screwed forever. At least one good thing happened to him. He thanks Roxy, and she immediately tells them to switch shifts now. And before he leaves, the girl tells him to contact her if this kind of thing happens again. Fate, afraid of reprisals, says it's okay and she shouldn't worry, and after that he leaves. He goes to a bar and eats while thinking about what Roxy said. He is afraid to tell her what is happening because he knows Raphael well. At some point, the bar owner comes to talk to him and says that if he continues like this, he will end up like the other guy who was abused until the end. Fate just finishes eating and pays for the meal. While leaving, Fate continues to rumble. No matter how much he eats, his hunger doesn't go away. You'll find out why in a bit, but let's focus on now. Fate observes some people jumping over the city walls and realizes they are bandits. He doesn't waste time and immediately goes to inform Roxy of what happened. She tells Fate to stay in her place and goes after the scoundrel bandits. She deals with almost all of them, but one of them manages to escape and passes through the gate where Fate was. The boy is without reaction and even thinks about running away. But thinking about it, he says that this would bring problems for Roxy since it happened while she was on guard. And then Fate gathers courage and hits the spear in the belly of the scoundrel bandit. At that moment, something strange happens. After hitting the bandit, a voice says that the gluttony ability has been activated, and Fate's status has increased. In addition, 2 abilities were added, namely Identify and Telepathy. Fate doesn't understand what happened, and soon Roxy comes to see how he is. She takes his hands and asks if he's okay. Upon touching her, the telepathy ability is activated, and Fate can hear her thoughts. But he doesn't say anything, just says he's okay, and that leaves her relieved. After that, she lets go of his hands and says she'll report to her superiors. And at that moment, without touching her, he realizes that he can't hear any more of her thoughts. Fate says yes, it's okay for her to go. He also tells her to take credit for everything, which she thinks is very wrong since he helped by hitting one of them too. Fate explains that if Raphael finds out that he did this, he will probably implicate him, so it's better for her to take all the credit. She understands even so but says she should reward him anyway. And soon she has an idea. She asks Fate what he thinks about working for the Hart family. Fate is reluctant at first but ends up being convinced to accept since his life will be much better there. After that, Fate goes home and checks his status. He notices that now he has triple digits in each of them. In addition, 2 new abilities have appeared. Fate then remembers hearing Roxy's thoughts and imagines that it was the telepathy ability. And then Fate imagines that he has become stronger. And he says that maybe it's time for him to start hunting some monsters. The next day, he goes to a weapons dealer to buy a sword. The dealer asks how much budget he has, and Fate shows 2 silver coins. The dealer gets angry and calls him poor. Fate, thinking, says that's all he got after working for 5 years. Then the dealer says that with what he has, he will only be able to buy some old swords that are in a barrel. Fate thinks it's better than nothing, and he starts picking them up one by one using the identify ability he received earlier, until at some point, he picks up a black sword that he finds interesting. And out of nowhere, the sword speaks to him, which scares him. The sword tells him to buy it, and it will make it worth it. The name of the sword is Greed, and you will soon find out why it is called that. Fate buys it and goes to the fields outside the city to see if he can find some monsters. Soon some goblins appear, and Fate is scared. But despite the scare, he deals with them easily. And with each goblin that was defeated, both his status and abilities were transferred to Fate. Until in the end, he raised his powers a lot, with some status reaching thousands of points, as well as gaining 2 new abilities, one being a low strength improvement and also a low vitality improvement. Then the sword asks him if he is full now. And Fate notes that no, not yet satisfied since you haven't left a like or subscribed to this channel yet. I'm watching you, subscribe there. Fate notes that for the first time in his life, he feels satisfied and his stomach has stopped growling. At this moment we discover that Fate's gluttony ability is not for food but for souls of living being, a bit macabre isn't it? Fate tells the sword that he thought he would have only the ability he received at birth forever. The sword says that this is normal, but his ability is different from the others. Fate will not gain XP by defeating monsters, but he will take all the status and abilities of those he defeats for himself. Then some adventurers come from afar, and the sword tells Fate to collect the goblin's ears quickly to get the reward at the guild. He must do this quickly, as it would not be good if other people discovered his true powers. And so he does. After receiving his reward, he says he will eat meat since it's been a long time since he's done so. And while walking down the street, he bumps into a suspicious guy who is with a little girl. The guy insults him and tells him to pay attention to where he's going. And at that moment, the little girl touches Fate, and he can hear her calling for help through telepathy. Fate hesitates but decides to go after him to save that girl. He arrives where she is confined and hears the bandit saying that that little girl will be fun for the holy knights. And Fate says he will save her at all costs. At some point, the guy moves away, and Fate soon approaches and releases the girl. But it wouldn't be easy like that, would it? The bandit soon appears behind Fate and says that there's always a funny guy wanting to play hero. Fate then takes the girl and takes her to a safe place since holding her wouldn't allow him to fight. After finding a place, he waits for the bandit to approach and knocks down some boxes on him. Then Fate starts fighting seriously. He activates his ability called Sharp Blade and Fate's sword warns him to be careful with that. When the scoundrel attacks, the sword tells Fate to hit the center of the sword, and so he does. As a result, the bandit's sword is split in half, and the thug receives a deep cut to his chest. Then Fate asks who told him to do that, and the guy says he won't snitch on anyone. But Fate takes his sword and puts it inside the cut he made earlier, causing the bandit to feel a lot of pain and be convinced to tell who is behind the kidnapping. Fate discovers that the mastermind behind it is Hado Vlarik, that scoundrel who beat up Fate earlier. Apparently, he also abuses children, hence the kidnappings. What a disgusting guy, I hope he goes to hell as soon as possible. After that, Fate leaves with the girl and tells her that everything is okay now. And at that moment, the poor girl's stomach growls. Fate then decides to take her to eat, and soon he buys some meat skewers, which makes the girl very happy, since according to her, she had never eaten meat in her life before. After that, Fate takes her to the church where she lives with nuns and other children who were also abandoned. The sister thanks Fate, and he is surprised. She asks why this is so, and Fate replies that he has never been grateful before since he has a weak ability and has always been treated like trash. The little girl asks what it is, and he just says that she only makes him hungry. Then he approaches her and gives an important advice. Fate says that no matter how difficult it is, if you can do everything with a smile on your face, happiness will certainly come one day. And he remembers that one day it was his father who said the same thing to him. After that, he leaves. While walking, he decides he wants to get stronger. Even though he won the previous fight, he had to rely on luck for that, and he doesn't want to depend on it forever. Then he remembers that he has to buy new clothes since tomorrow he starts working at the Hart family's house. And so it happens, early in the morning Fate arrives there, now well-dressed. Right off the bat, Roxy comes to greet him, and Fate is completely paralyzed when he sees her. She asks why, and he replies that she looks beautiful, and that left him speechless. Roxy is embarrassed and says that he looks good in his new clothes. And soon he enters to meet the mansion. Roxy takes him to her father's grave. She tells him that he died recently when he went to Gallia, a continent dominated by monsters. And there he found a divine dragon that had not awakened for at least 1,000 years, and this dragon ended up killing his father and his entire army. Fate thinking sees that even in this difficult situation, Roxy was still kind to him and helped him. That's why he must give everything to help her from now on. Then the family governess arrives, and they are introduced. After that, Fate goes to eat, and everyone is impressed with how much meat he can eat, which also makes the governess very angry since he has no manners at all. Some time later, Roxy calls Fate to talk. She asks him if he has gotten used to the job, but Fate doesn't pay attention to what she says. He can only think that he has been getting more and more hungry and doesn't understand why since he has been eating a lot every day. Meanwhile, Roxy keeps calling him Faye repeatedly until he gets scared and she asks what's wrong with him. Fate remembers that his father also called him Faye and he explains it to her. Fate also explains that his father was killed in a monster hunt. Roxy says that it was the same for her, but tells him not to worry since they are now like a family and should take care of each other. Upon hearing this, Fate feels very embarrassed and asks her to call him by his name, but she refuses and says she will keep calling him Faye. But as he spoke, his vision darkens and he faints. That night he wakes up and reads a note left by Roxy. In the letter, she asked him to rest properly. After reading it, he goes to talk to his sword and asks her what happened, since he never felt bad in that way, even after eating a lot. The sword explains to Fate that once he tastes the flavor of a soul, he won't be able to stop consuming them. And it's been a long time since Fate defeated those goblins. She also warns him that if he stays too long without hunting monsters, he may lose control and attack anyone in his way. Fate then wastes no time and goes into the forest to hunt goblins. He kills several, but his hunger is not satisfied. He then decides to enter the forest to find stronger monsters, and so it happened. He soon slaughters several hobgoblins, which are a type of larger and stronger goblin, until finally he feels satisfied. However, while he was thinking of leaving, he sees a giant goblin passing by with a human in his hand. The sword informs him that it is the Goblin King, and his stats are similar to Fate's, so it will be a tough fight. Fate goes after the big guy and has difficulty fighting him, but fortunately, he manages to find an opening and slays the goblin. Now Fate has double the stats he had before, and the sword says that with those numbers Fate would be able to use his new form. However, the cost for this is to give up all the stats he has gained until today. Fate is reluctant, but remembers that without her, he would have nothing and would continue to be treated like trash by the knights. And so he decides to give all his points to the sword. And thus she activates her greed ability, steals all of Fate's points, and soon his second form is shown. She takes the form of a bow and tells Fate to test her. Fate doesn't know how to use it, and she just tells him to do it as if he were pulling an imaginary arrow and releasing it. And she also says that no matter where he aims, the arrow will always hit the target he chose. And so he does, and easily slays one of the hobgoblins that was nearby. After that, he returns to the city and leaves the ears of the Goblin King at the church door, saying that by selling them they can eat for a good while. Shall we? One morning, Fate sees a strange girl leaving the Heart Mansion and asks her brusquely who she is. When the girl turns around, she reveals herself as Roxy, and Fate is startled. She gets angry and says he scared her. Fate explains that he didn't recognize her because her clothes are quite different from her usual attire. Fate then asks where she's going dressed like that. She whispers to Fate that she's going to the city for a secret inspection and tells him not to tell anyone because if Haru, the housekeeper, finds out, she's in trouble. Fate says he understands and goes back to his work. But as he's about to leave, the girl grabs him by the collar and says she has an idea. She gives him a confidential mission to accompany her as an escort. And so it happens, they head to the city, and Roxy seems quite happy. If I didn't know everything, I'd almost say they're on a date, but let's continue. Roxy walks through the city, and at one point, Fate calls her Roxy-sama. Immediately, she tells him to stop and says that if he calls her that, people will recognize her. Detail, she hasn't changed her face at all, just her clothes, and she thinks she's completely disguised, reminds me of a certain hero with tight pants. She suggests that he call her Rocky, quite different, right? Meanwhile, Fate's sword teases the situation, and he tells it to shut up. However, Roxy doesn't know he's talking to the sword and thinks he told her to be quiet. Fate is quite dense, isn't he? He tries to explain himself and says it's all right. Strangely, it works, and Roxy is in a good mood again. She says she's excited about the idea of the two of them going out together and gives him a beautiful smile. His sword plays along with the situation, and Fate tells it to shut up again. At that moment, Roxy says she won't allow him to treat his weapon with such violence, and Fate apologizes. Then, Roxy mentions that she's never really looked at Fate's sword. Fate becomes concerned because it's not normal for someone with a seemingly useless ability like his to have a sword. At one point, Fate accidentally drops his sword, but before it hits the ground, Roxy catches it. She takes a good look at his sword and says it's really beautiful. Roxy tells him that he should take better care of the sword and mentions that she'll take him to the Hart family's blacksmith for maintenance soon. After that, they continue walking through the city. Roxy and Fate explore all the stalls and even taste some grapes that Fate finds very delicious. At this point, Roxy slips up and mentions that the grapes are grown at her home. The merchant finds it strange, but with the help of his sword, Fate helps her get out of the situation. He says that Roxy's family works for the Hart family, and that's why she lives near the vineyard. The merchant understands, and Roxy thanks Fate for saving her. At that moment, a holy night passes by, and as always, the people are not very receptive to them. As he passed by, Fate's stomach rumbles, attracting his attention. He asks who did that, and immediately goes in Fate's direction. The boy apologizes and bows, but before the knight could kick him, Roxy tells him to stop. She says Fate has already apologized, and now the conniving knight's attention turns to her. He asks who she is, and upon closer inspection, he says her face isn't strange and starts to remember. One of the nearby people asks if she isn't Roxy, and Fate, with the help of his sword, pretends that they are a couple. Immediately, they get closer, and Roxy starts inventing a story, saying that he didn't eat the breakfast she prepared for him. Fate goes along with it, acting as if they were a couple, successfully diverting any suspicions that the girl might be Roxy. After apologizing again, they leave, and everyone says it's impossible for that to be Roxy because, to everyone there, holy knights can't cook. After that, Fate and Roxy head to an alley, and she continues to stick close to him. Fate can hear her thoughts thanks to his telepathy ability. Fate sees that Roxy is somewhat embarrassed about clinging to a man's arm, but she also reveals that her heart is pounding. After hearing this, Fate lets her go and apologizes. Roxy says it's okay, and she's already used to it. While they walk, Roxy asks if Fate knows any warriors. Fate asks why, and at that moment, they hear people talking about a monster that's killing all the goblins, which piques Roxy's interest. She goes to inquire, wanting to know more details. However, they say they don't know much and suggest she ask an adventurer. She then asks Fate to take her to where the warriors are. He agrees, and they head to a tavern to gather information. Upon arriving, the tavern owner is very surprised because, to him, Fate was supposed to be dead. Fate and Roxy sit down, and he introduces Roxy by the name of Rocky. The tavern owner expresses his surprise at Fate's reappearance, especially with a girlfriend. Fate feels embarrassed, and Roxy also becomes somewhat nervous and embarrassed, to the point where she breaks the glass she was holding. After Fate's sword teases him, he also ends up breaking his glass. Then they have a little to eat while the guy shares what he knows about the goblin monster. According to him, an adventurer went to kill some goblins to make some money and found a pile of corpses with their ears still intact, suggesting that it might have been another monster. Adventurers collect goblin ears to bring to the guild and claim their rewards. Little do they know that the one responsible for all of this is right there, with that dumbfounded look on his face. The tavern owner also mentions that this could be bad for business since the trade route passes close to where the attacks are happening. With a possible monster on the loose, many people won't want to take the risk, which would weaken the local economy. They suspect it might be a lich, which is kind of like a restless soul. An old man at the tavern says that adventurers will form a group to go after the big creature. At this point, other adventurers enter the tavern, and one of them comes to Roxy and invites her to have some fun. Little do they know that she's a holy knight. Fate quickly stands up and tells them to stop. Roxy also stands up, and with a simple move, she sends the Joker flying. At this moment, they realize that she is Roxy, and they quickly kneel before her, asking for forgiveness. She says it's alright and tells them to get up. She explains that knights should protect the citizens, and seeing the population so afraid of them is something that embarrasses her. They say she's just like her father and a good person. After that, they all have fun, and Roxy wins in an arm wrestling contest against everyone. Later, Fate and Roxy go to the Hart family's blacksmith, who gives Fate's sword some maintenance, which makes the sword very happy. Fate thanks the blacksmith and asks Roxy why she doesn't have any information about the monster. Roxy explains that the Vlarik family is controlling the information and not sharing anything with her, so she had to investigate on her own. At this moment, they hear the voice of Hado, that conniving knight, causing a commotion in the city. When they arrive, they see that he's holding a child, and as we've seen before, this guy likes to have fun with children. Roxy arrives and tells him to stop. The Shady Knights claim they're just taking a lost child for their protection. Yeah, right. Fate steps forward and makes Hado let go of the child. They take the boy, and Roxy says she'll take care of him. Before leaving, Hado tries to start trouble with Fate, but his leader tells him to stop and follow. Afterward, Fate and Roxy take the boy to eat and quickly find his mother, who thanks them for protecting her son. Later, Fate asks his sword for a way to hunt monsters without being recognized. The sword suggests using a mask that prevents him from being recognized, an enchanted item that makes him appear different to anyone who sees him. After that, Fate buys a raw ore and gives it to Roxy as a thank you gift for their day together. But he says he doesn't know if there's any gem inside and asks her to open it. Of course, he used his identification ability and already knew everything. When Roxy opens it, she finds a beautiful gem inside and is very happy with the gift. The next day, Roxy invites Fate to accompany her on a trip. They go to the Hart family's cultivation lands, where the grapes they tasted in the city are produced. When they arrive, Roxy's mother welcomes them. She asks who the boy with her is. Roxy introduces him and says he's the new employee she hired, and she brought him to introduce him to everyone. Her mother's name is Aisha Hart. She calls Fate over and asks if he likes Roxy. At this point, Roxy becomes very embarrassed, and her mother simply says she wants to know Fate's opinion of her. Fate replies that he does like Roxy very much and even adds that he would like to serve her for the rest of his life. This leaves the girl very embarrassed, and she quickly runs away. Later, Fate helps with the grape harvest along with Roxy. While talking to other employees, Fate learns that Roxy always comes there at this time of year because the kobolds come after the ripe grapes and end up destroying the plantation. Roxy comes to deal with them and never lets them endanger anyone. At this moment, Fate's stomach growls, and he doesn't understand why since he recently hunted many goblins. The sword explains that perhaps his gluttony ability is craving souls of other monsters besides goblins. After they finish harvesting the grapes, Roxy tells Fate to go back without her because she has something to do. While he's walking, he passes by a girl with a big axe. When he passes by, the girl talks to him, and Fate notices that her eyes are just like his. She says it seems like she arrived too early and tells Fate he can keep the kobolds. But she also says that Fate owes her one, and they will meet again soon. They better keep an eye on her. I have a strong feeling that this girl will be very important to the story. After that, Roxy arrives and comes to talk to Fate. Fate asks who that girl is, and Roxy doesn't know, but she says that it's clear she's a Gallian, someone born on the continent of Gallia, where Roxy's father died. Roxy explains that the place used to be prosperous before the arrival of the monsters that completely destroyed the country. Now, it's extremely rare to find a Gallian, but there are still some of them out there, like that girl. After that, Fate asks if Roxy will be fine hunting the kobolds alone and offers to help if needed. In response, she says there's no problem since she has several other warriors with her. The next day, they go to the vineyard and notice that a part of it has been completely destroyed by the kobolds. They decide to go for reconnaissance to discover the location of the kobold group. They easily find them, but something different from the usual is happening. In addition to the regular kobolds that appear every year, there's a kind of boss among them, an evolved monster much stronger than the regular ones. Fate checks his stats and notices that he's level 50 and has incredibly strong stats. Then they return, and the people in the village are worried because there's nothing they can do against that monster. Roxy, on the other hand, says she will dedicate herself to protecting everyone there. While she was speaking, Fate's sword says it's impossible for her to do it alone. Fate now has no alternative, he must help. That night, he goes into the forest and heads to where the kobolds are. He grabs his sword and uses its second form, the bow we've seen before. Fate starts shooting and kills them one by one. This causes his stats to rise rapidly. He switches the sword back to its normal form and advances, beating down the creatures. However, his stats are still not enough to fight the boss. Fate goes on to kill the remaining normal kobolds, and now there's no way around it, he has to fight the boss. Fate goes after him and notices that the boss is using a dangerous ability with his fists, capable of penetrating armor to break bones and pulverize organs. He must be careful. The boss attacks, and Fate falls into the creek. The boss continues to attack Fate, but the boy manages to eliminate the last of the creatures surrounding the boss. With this, Fate can use an enhanced form of the bow, and he does so. Fate charges a powerful attack and shoots it at the boss, completely defeating him and leaving a huge trail of destruction. At this moment, Fate's gluttony ability is activated. As he obtained a massive amount of power by absorbing the boss kobold's stats, he might lose control. The sword tells him to control himself since if he loses control, he could become a bloodthirsty beast. The next day, Roxy and her group go to the location where the kobolds were, but they only find their corpses and a massive trail of destruction left by Fate's attack. She wonders who could have done this and returns home. Talking with her mother and Fate, she reports what she found when she got there. Fate acts as if he doesn't understand, and Roxy starts to suspect that it might be that Gallian girl they encountered the other day, as Gallians are known for being very strong. Later, Roxy's mother calls Fate to her room and makes a request to him, but don't get the wrong idea. She says she would like him to stay by her daughter's side to support her. Seeing her unwell, Fate readily accepts her request and says he will always stand by Roxy. And soon after, they leave. That night, Fate goes to look for more goblins to satisfy his hunger. However, as expected, the goblins no longer satisfy him. His eye remains red, indicating that he needs new souls. Fate starts using an eye patch and goes to the bar he always visits. There, he learns that the knights are going on a new expedition to Gallia, the same place where Roxy's father went and ultimately died. Fate becomes worried because Roxy will probably have to go too. Later, Roxy goes to her father's grave to tell him that she has also been assigned to the expedition to Gallia. At that moment, Fate appears and asks her not to do it, as she might not come back from there. But the girl is determined to go, and there's nothing Fate can do. He then decides to get stronger to be able to protect her. While he hunts monsters to get stronger, Hado and a group of adventurers find him and ask if he's the monster people are talking about. Now, things are about to get serious. But we'll only find out in the next episode. So, what do you think will happen? Share your thoughts in the comments. And while you're down there, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps me out, you know. And finally, for those of you who always stick around till the end, I've left a video for you as a gift on the end screen. It tells the story of Rakuro, a guy addicted to bad games, but one day, he's advised to play a divine game without bugs and flaws. He gets hooked and embarks on an exciting and fun adventure. Click there, it's awesome. Until next time, folks.